screen, we will have two panelists from Japan and New Zealand joining us to discuss perspectives from the Pacific as well as Japan's perspective on how they work on blue economy issues. To briefly introduce the panel today, I am delighted to welcome Ambassador Teburoro Tito, who's currently the Kiribati ambassador to the United Nations, the United States, and also the Kiribati ambassador designate to Mexico and Canada. Prior to his appointment to the diplomatic service of his country, Ambassador Tito had represented and served his people as the president of Kiribati. During his tenure as president, he arranged for Kiribati's membership of the United Nations and represented the country at the annual UN General Assembly summits from 1999 to 2002. We are delighted to have you with us here today, Ambassador, and thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Dr. Anna Pols, who is a senior lecturer at the Center for Defense and Security Studies at Tennessee University. Dr. Pols is also an associate scholar with the Macmillan Brown Center for Pacific Studies, University of Canterbury, and has previously held visiting fellowships with the East-West Center in Honolulu. My deepest gratitude to Dr. Pols, who joins us today around 2:30 a.m. her time for this conversation, and I'm really, really grateful for your time and for sharing your views and thoughts with us. Finally, we have Dr. Atsushi Watanabe, who's a senior research fellow with the Ocean Policy Institute at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Dr. Watanabe, since 2018, has been a senior researcher with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation Institute for for Ocean Policy, leading policy research on blue economy and blue carbon. Since July 2020, he has served as the director of the Japan Blue Economy Association, and we are absolutely thrilled to have you, Dr. Watanabe, to talk to us about the work you've been doing promoting issues of blue economy. Let me start by turning to our in-person guest, Ambassador Tito, to start us off for a conversation with your opening remarks on how you view security issues in the region, how Kiribati views the challenges in the region, and how the geopolitics of today impact your island nation. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, in Kiribati we say Maori, which means abundant life on all of you, and my respect to the people of the land and to your people. Greetings from Kiribati, Maori from Kiribati. And I must say, I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. I've always been thinking of what security really means in our part of the world. And I have to go back to the days, the dark days of in our history. Let me go back to the Second World War. We were suddenly surprised to have people coming to our shores and making our place a battleground. I mean, that was very, very disturbing because we've never used to that sort of stuff. People coming from outside and turning our ocean and our islands into battlegrounds. And people were scared. I wasn't there, but my father was there. He had a few children older than me, and I wasn't around, but from what I heard, it was very, very scary time. People were scared. They were never scared in their life until these things came to the islands. Of course, there were spots in history before that when we had the Christian pastors coming from different parts of the world, and they created division. We were one people, one village, one community, kind of working together. They suddenly we were chopped up by people from outside coming and saying, you belong to here. And that's a terrible religion, and that's a terrible culture. We must go and destroy these. So there was fighting. That goes back to the 1860, 1870. That was a long time ago, But then I'm talking about 1940, 41, 40, around that time, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, then we suddenly see people coming to our shores with all these strange-looking things. They explode and fire and kill people. And with swords, and they chop necks. They chop people like that, you see? So I'm talking about that sort of security. You're talking about security. What is security? It's a term that comes from the outside world. But for us, we have We have troubles in the village. We have little fights, we fight over a coconut tree or whatever, or our ladies, kind of men. Little things, little fights. They're not security problem as far as we are concerned. They're manageable. We can manage it. When the elders of the village sit down and they talk, it's finished. The next day it's all calm and back to normal again. So security to me is an external thing created by people from outside. And that is number one point. And so we're talking about security nowadays, the same thing. I would say the same thing about security nowadays. We're always at peace. Comes an election, then people start dividing. Because politicians link to this and to this. And some politicians are sponsored with lots of money to go and preach a particular narrative. This is bad, this is good, this is dangerous, beware. And this is what security means to the island people. And I want to see a world back to where it was. I don't know. Shall we achieve it? I'm not very sure, because I can see the world getting more and more complicated. With all the military apparatus all over the place, taking over the place. And it's business, big business. We're investing in it. It's like investing in donuts or bread. And you want to keep that donut and bread selling. And so you have to keep on creating an environment, a niche, to make sure that this product keeps selling. And this is the trouble, I see. Security is not a problem for us. It's a problem created by people from outside who have their own narrative of life, who have their own way of seeing life, going out and getting more and more and more. In the islands, we already have enough. Enough fish, enough eels, enough octopus, enough coconut, enough breadfruit, except when it's in drought, then we have problems. That's when we start praying and we start calling on the world and we start doing our magic sometimes. We can create the rain to fall sometimes. It all depends on who you're talking about. So that is my view of security. Is an external concept, it's an external idea which we're trying to grapple with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for putting us how you view security and the region and the island views it, that it's an external issue, it's an external problem that is brought to your shores and how you deal with it. And I do look forward to getting into some of these questions during a conversation. Let me turn to our virtual speakers now. Anna, if I may come to you to share with us how, you look at the Pacific as a whole, but also from a New Zealand perspective, what are the key issues, what are the key challenges in the Pacific today that I guess consumes most of the conversations, but also if you might allude to the recent alliance between Australia, US, and UK, where I think New Zealand has come up and probably with a strong statement on it. How do these conversations shape the geopolitics of the region? You might be muted, sorry.
Thank you very much, and tēnā koutou katoa. It is a pleasure to be here from Aotearoa, even though it is so early in the morning. And my greetings to President Tito as well. What I will do is just cover off on three areas and capture some of what you have spoken about, Dashana. Firstly, how has geopolitical competition manifested in the Pacific, and what dynamics have emerged as a consequence of that? What are some of the Pacific regional security priorities and perspectives? And I include New Zealand in that as well. I'll expand on that. And what challenges are posed by geopolitical competition to the Pacific? So just to start off with, the Pacific region, as we would all be very familiar with because we're having this conversation, is a increasingly contested strategic environment as a consequence of the tension between the growing influence of external actors and sub-regional security dynamics, which are also seeking to redefine the Pacific regional order. And while Pacific states remain generally wedded to a rules-based international order, the way in which Pacific states are engaging with each other and the world at large and the issues driving regional agendas is changing the substance and form of regional cooperation, partially in response to geopolitical pressures and intensifying intra-regional dynamics. So old assumptions about the traditional security orthodoxy are therefore no longer particularly useful now when we talk about the region. So a number of dynamics have emerged as a consequence of this. I'm going to briefly highlight a couple of those. One, the Pacific is redefining how the region understands and responds to security challenges and driving a security narrative which prioritizes non-traditional security threats to the Pacific, including, as we've heard over yesterday, the existential threat of climate change through organizations such as the Pacific Islands Forum, as well as sub-regional organizations. And this reprioritization of security has led to the rise of a new Pacific security agenda and a growing Pacific consensus that is seeking to further define the region's priorities and how it responds to the challenges that we are talking about over this few days. And an increasingly frustration on the part of Pacific leaders and countries that Pacific perspectives about security have been treated as subordinate to the dominant narrative. And a key example of this is the 2018 Boy Declaration on Regional Security, which recognized and responded to the need to shape the narrative and prioritize Pacific security priorities in light of this, as the declaration states, an increasingly crowded and complex region and the need for forum member states to pursue collective security interests. And other examples of the new security agenda include the Blue Pacific narrative and the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, which is currently under development and which will articulate approximately 20 drivers of change identified as events, actions, and decisions that have the potential to generate significant disruption in the Pacific. The second dynamic is that since 2017, we have seen what I refer to as a Pacific policy redux, as strategic anxieties about loss of relevance and influence have converged alongside concerns about growing Chinese influence in the Pacific, leading to the rapid recalibration of policies by Canberra, Wellington, the United States, UK, Indonesia, Japan, France, and so on. And in the case of the Pacific's main partners, Australia and New Zealand, concerns about the loss of relevance and strategic influence were particularly acute. And in both cases, via Australia's Pacific Step Up and New Zealand's Pacific Reset, there have been some inroads in terms of their engagement with the region and the articulation of concerns. For New Zealand particularly, this has resulted in a growing divergence with its main ally and closest partner, which is Australia. And we saw some of this manifest over the last few days in response to the Australia, UK, US Defence Pact. Now, to the extent that this has taken place more broadly, what we have now is a dynamic in which Pacific states are hedging between Australia and China rather than the United States and China. And this is not a sufficiently well understood fact outside the region, but it in part explains some of the disjuncture that exists between the Pacific region and where it sees itself within the broader Indo-Pacific framework. So in terms of Pacific regional security priorities and perspectives on threats, the Boy Declaration, which I mentioned before, explicitly states that climate change is the existential threat facing the Pacific. There's also growing consensus with respect to maritime security, notably illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, as well as transnational crime, the security implications of climate change, including displacement of populations, food insecurity, and the possibility of conflict as a consequence of climate change. With respect to China, there isn't a Pacific consensus as such. 4 of Taiwan's allies are in the Pacific: Nauru, Palau, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands. And previously, when China has encouraged the Pacific Islands Forum to adopt the One China policy, the Forum has been able to push back, citing the fact that first 6 and then 4 of its members recognized Taiwan. That is now obviously changed with the split of the Micronesian member states from the Forum, which is currently underway. Tuvalu will be the only remaining member of the Pacific Islands Forum that recognizes Taiwan. Now, Pacific Island leaders do not necessarily see China's increased presence in the Pacific in negative terms. The former Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Dame McTaylor, said in 2018 that if there's one word that resonates amongst all former forum members when it comes to China, that word is access. Access to markets, access to technology, financing, infrastructure, access to a viable future. Other Pacific Island leaders have similarly viewed their disquiet about the increasing focus of their partners on strategic competition in the region. In 2018, Samoa's Prime Minister Toilepa described the focus on strategic competition as a form of strategic manipulation because the big powers are doggedly pursuing strategies to widen and extend their reach and inculcating a far-reaching sense of insecurity. Pacific leaders have been and continue to be particularly concerned about the implication that they may have to make a choice between China and their other partners. And this has been rejected over and over again by a number of Pacific leaders. So where those, in terms of security threats, perhaps is best summed up by Fiji's military chief in 2019, who stated at Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore that there are 3 major powers in competition in our region: the US, China, and climate change. And of the 3, climate change is winning. And that gives an indication of where the priorities lie for many Pacific countries. So what challenges then do increased attention and geopolitical competition pose to the Pacific region? Now, the 2 interrelated challenges have arisen as a consequence of increased attention to the region. The first is, while valid in most part, that the current strategic narrative puts too much focus on major powers' geostrategic interests, whilst without recognizing the region's complexities, or including non-traditional security challenges, nor necessarily recognizing or supporting Pacific needs and priorities, the nuances and complexities of the region, and particularly the intersection between local and geopolitical dynamics. The danger of this approach is that it will lead to narrow calculations based on material power and undermine genuine understanding of strategic understanding of the interconnected threats that the Pacific faces. The other danger to this is that there is a perception in parts of the Pacific that the region has been incorporated into the Indo-Pacific strategic framing with little regard for Pacific perspectives. Only today, yesterday, a young Pacific academic presented his research on this very issue at a conference that I was chairing. There needs to be a far better balance between countering China and responding to the priorities of Pacific Island countries. The second impact is that there are credible concerns that wider geopolitical tensions and the responses to competition within the region will negatively impact Pacific regionalism itself. And it's fundamental that Pacific regionalism is viewed as a front line, not a fault line, and that regionalism is the buffer between the Pacific and the challenges to the international rules-based order. Now, second, third, what we haven't seen in the Pacific yet, and what we have seen elsewhere, though, is the rise of national interest at the expense of regionalism. There remains consensus on issues such as climate change, as I mentioned before, maritime security, and the non-traditional threats as outlined in the Boy Declaration, the Blue Pacific, and other strategies. However, the rise of national interest is something that we can't potentially ignore. The Micronesian state split from the Forum was about national interest, but it wasn't directly caused by geopolitical competition, although that backdrop has provided some ammunition. So there are no guarantees, though, that national interest won't begin to impact regionalism, and the economic and social impact of COVID-19, for example, may potentially exacerbate this. And the fourth point is that China has engaged in disruptive practices in the Pacific in seeking influence, resources, and votes, has sought to capture elites and conduct what are essentially foreign influence and all foreign interference activities. And this itself has played out as a disruptor in the region too. So I look forward to discussing this with you further, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
That was really great, and you alluded to I guess how China is described in terms of access, whether it's market financing on climate change, and we do have right after in the afternoon a panel on development cooperation and climate financing, and we'll have the Australian Deputy PR here speaking as well as JBIC. So I hope some of those questions can then spill over there as well. Let me turn to you, Watanabe-san, to speak to us about. I mean, one of the things Anna said is that a better balance between countering China and what the region needs. And I think the region has continuously and consistently talked about climate change and issues of blue economy. So really pleased to have you here, and I'll turn the floor to you.
Darshana, thank you. And can you hear me? Good. Okay, so I'm honored to be here today to speak at this excellent dialogue. And thank you, Ambassador Tito and Dr. Anna, for sharing with us the enlightening presentation. So today, I'd like to talk about the blue economy and the Pacific Island countries. And the blue economy is a term that has been increasingly used internationally since 2010. And it is a set of measures and tools to promote a sustainable ocean economy. And the blue economy includes fisheries, coastal and marine tourism, marine renewable energy, shipping, and aquaculture. Furthermore, conservation and management of marine and coastal resources that contribute to the sustainable use of the marine environment is and should be at the root of the blue economy. And for island countries with large economic exclusive zones, fishing and the tourism are particularly important as sources of income, and sustainably securing these sources of income is essential for economic and food security. So for example, in Kiribati, access fees to the tuna fishery accounted for 70% of government revenue from 2015 to 2018, making it a very pivotal source of income. And other countries such as Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Nauru are also highly dependent on tuna fishing. Island countries are highly dependent on natural resources, and this means that coping and adapting to climate change and the natural disasters will be an essential factor in promoting the blue economy. Impact of climate change is the change in the distribution patterns of highly migratory fish, such as skipjack, yellowfin, and the big-eye tuna. And under the high global GHG, greenhouse gas emission scenario, tuna is projected to shift the distribution to the north and east in the Pacific. And in such a scenario, the tuna biomass is expected to shift to the high seas, causing a large decrease in fishery income, especially in countries like Nauru, Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu. And coastal fisheries are also need to be taken into consideration in blue economy. We often hear that the coastal fisheries are an important source of protein for Pacific Islanders. But since the economic contribution is small compared to tuna fishing, the importance of resource management as a policy is often overlooked. So it is also important to listen to and support the voices of small-scale fishers. We also need to consider that the overfishing of coral reef fish leads to the degradation of the coral reef environment. So it is necessary to take measures to allocate resources from coral reef fish to offshore fish by enabling, for example, small-scale fishers to fish for tuna and skipjack tuna at a fish aggregating device. And sorry. It is also important to consider the tourism in island nation, which is characterized by its dependence on marine and coastal environment. And the beautiful and rich ocean is an indispensable tourism resources, producing vast tourism revenues in nations like Palau and the Cook Island. And there are but also concerns about the impact of climate change on tourism. So in Palau, the jellyfish in Jellyfish Lake disappeared during the El Nino year in 2016, causing massive damage to tourism revenue for several years. And also super typhoons in 2012 and 2013 also devastated the eastern side of coral reefs, affecting the diving industry. Self-sustaining renewable energy sources that are not dependent on external fossil fuel supplies are also important to strengthen the resilience of island blue economy. While onshore solar and wind power generation countries, the use of marine renewable energy has made little progress. So the island areas in southern Japan have a natural environment similar to that of Pacific Island countries, and they are also 90% dependent on thermal power generation for energy. So to combat such situation, Kumejima, one of the islands in that area, is promoting ocean thermal energy conversion, OTEC, a technology that uses the temperature difference between deep sea water and the surface water to generate electricity, and is particularly promising in tropical region. And the OTEC demonstration site at Kumejima provides stable power generation and also multiple uses of deep sea water. The deep sea water is cold and rich in minerals, and it is used for land-based aquaculture and agriculture, and also development of cosmetics. So it's generating a significant employment and economic benefits. And in Nauru, a Japanese group will start a pre-feasibility study for the introduction of OTEC. So in these studies, it is also important to consider the multiple uses of deep sea water other than power generation to create new industries on the island. Lastly, I'd like to mention about the need for human resource development. In addition to the offshore fisheries, coastal fisheries, and the marine, also need to consider the port, marine surveillance, and marine litter problems to realize the blue economy. So policymakers and educators with a long-term vision who understand these diverse ocean issues will be created. Since 1987, the Nippon Foundation and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation have been providing scholarship for qualified students to study at the World Maritime University in Sweden. So the program has already produced approximately 700 graduates, and many of them from the Pacific region. So I believe that it is important for developing countries such as Japan and non-state actors like as NGOs like us to provide sustainable assistance. So I hope that NGO like us can seize the momentum and take the lead in the dialogue with the Pacific country states. So that is all for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Watanabe-san, for that. Ambassador Tito, let me start the conversation with you in terms of, Anna alluded to it, and from what you also said in terms of the security challenges in the region. And of course, climate change is something that comes out very clearly and on top of the agenda. So in your role as the ambassador to the UN, What are your engagements in terms of bringing that issue out? Do you think it is being heard by the bigger powers in the region that this is a serious security issue to the island nations?
Yes, I am happy that as someone who has an opportunity to make a voice in the UN, and I do make my voice heard. Yes, I'm happy and I'm grateful to the United Nations and the international community and many partners who see climate change as a security issue for the people of the islands. And rightly so, it is. But people are sometimes misread what's going on, because they're far away, they're sort of picking up a telescope thousands of miles and trying to and explain something which we other people are experiencing it, and sometimes they get things wrong, and they start driving the issue in a direction that we really this really not meant for us. Let me explain what I mean. See, we must have seen a lot of clips in the social media about Kiribati sinking, Kiribati finished, Kiribati not going to be there in the next 50 or 60. I mean, you can see a lot of these things happen. Now, these are done by people that, I thank them for telling the world that that's, it's very scary and not very, the future might not be a bright one for the people. Fine, but up to a point, because if you oversay that, you're really chasing away all the potential investors that are ready to come and build resorts on our beautiful paradise islands, you see? And I have this problem when I came in, I talk with people, oh, no, Kiribati is finished, we're not coming. No, that's not good. No, we're finished. We're not going to invest money in a place which is sinking. Now that is one downside of over-publicizing and not telling the right story. They tell it from their point of view. I don't know, who are these people? Maybe they've got a self-interest to invest, to get UN money to build what they call floating islands, because some of them are actually talking about, how about having floating islands for you people? And I say, no, we're not going to be on floating islands. We're not going to be that. No. But there's a coconut tree on it, and there is a pandanus, and there is a community hall and children's park. No, but we're not interested, you see? So it depends who is telling the story. We will tell the story, and they must listen to us. But if they're not, because their ears more on the other side, people pushing their own narrative for their own interest, I think that is where we may go wrong. We may never help the people. We spend all the money somewhere else. All these people in the clouds, I call them, wanting money in the cloud, not coming down to the ground. We need the money to come and build seawalls. Where is that money? We haven't seen it. And we've been talking about 10, 15. They still say, yeah, we're researching, we're talking about it, we are discussing, forming, compact agreements, whatever you call them, frameworks, compact, whatever, the words, the nice words. It's like a cloud there. It's just, not coming down. It's just absorbing itself in the cloud. And that is the fault. That is one problem with our climate security issue. The climate security means, we're being affected. We're moving. Somebody is moving the houses. The wells are getting salty. We drink water from the well. We're not growing coconut, pandanus, breadfruits. They're dying. Why? Because the soil water is there. We need the solutions, not just the theories and all these narratives, which is good for people who are telling the story. But it's not our story. So that is how I see things. I'm grateful I have this opportunity to try and correct the record, try and correct the narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And you mentioned specifically in terms of examples that will be helpful, like seawall that you talked about, that is important. And yesterday we had the Maldives Minister for State for Foreign Affairs who was saying how the seawall actually built by Japan to a great degree had helped with the tsunami in the Indian Ocean region. So these are the issues, I guess, this forum is for, to bring out what are the areas and issues that can be worked by bigger powers while addressing concerns in the islands. So thank you for that. Anna, I wanted to come to you on you talked about, growing divergences between the two key players in the Pacific, New Zealand and Australia, on some of the issues, and we've seen that in the last couple of days over the submarine deal. I was wondering if you might want to talk us through a little bit on that in terms of the divergences and how that might play out, keeping in mind that also both New Zealand and Australia are part of the Five Eyes. So how do you think these divergences, the two countries that are in the region but see things differently, I suppose?
Okay, thank you, Deshana. I think it's important to state, first of all, that certainly from a New Zealand perspective, the alliance with Australia is fundamentally important to New Zealand, and that certainly hasn't changed and is very unlikely to change. That said, we have seen some areas of growing divergence, but also obviously areas where there is considerable convergence of ideas and thinking. But certainly what struck people when the defense agreement was announced last week was the fact that we have a situation where Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States have signed this defense pact, and obviously there was Aotearoa and Canada were not included in that. From a New Zealand perspective, there was no expectation that New Zealand would be included in that. It's simply by the very nature of the fact that it's dealing with military tech in a league which New Zealand simply is not. Also because the nuclear powered submarine deal for Australia is sort of the first cab off the rank for the agreement, and New Zealand has a long-standing bipartisan anti-nuclear policy, and that is not likely to change at all. So the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, did make this statement that certainly Morrison, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, had called her the night before it was announced and briefed her on it. But there was certainly no expectation on New Zealand's part that New Zealand would be part of this. What it is showing, though, is that there is an increasing gap between Australia and New Zealand in both strategically, because Australia is becoming much closer, its integration, its defense and security integration with the United States is deepening, and certainly it is taking a much clearer line with respect to China, for instance. And for New Zealand, that does create a number of concerns. And one of those is obviously the fact that our closest ally is increasingly divergent with respect to interoperability and with respect to defense capabilities, for instance, but also in terms of in the Pacific, where New Zealand has very much prioritized its focus. And I think, as the Prime Minister Ardern said last week, New Zealand was viewing the Defence Pact through the lens of what was good for the Pacific, what was in the interests of the Pacific, our region. And there is a sense that this could potentially, that the optics of it are not particularly good in light of the history and the legacy of nuclear testing in the Pacific. Not that Australia is doing that, obviously, that's been very clear, but just simply the optics of it. And so there's that growing divergence there. And that also leads to questions around New Zealand being increasingly strategically isolated with respect to its Five Eyes partners, and as well as Canada. Thank you.
In terms of the on blue economy, what are some of the areas that you think might be concrete examples or lessons that we can borrow from Japan's experience on, because you did allude to, again, the southern islands in Japan, so that would be Okinawa and the surrounding islands, and the concerns are similar, and we have similar concerns also in the Indian Ocean region, whether it is the island territories or island nations. So are there specific examples that you would give that would be useful for countries, bigger powers, while in conversation with island states, could work together in promoting blue economy, and maybe there is shared lessons for islands between the two oceans, whether in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific.
Oh,
Yes, Watanabe-san, sorry, yes, yeah,
Oh.
your question is to you.
okay. Sorry, I didn't think so. But okay. Yeah. Thank you, Darshana, for your question. And yes, we in Japan, as you mentioned, in the southern part of Japan, has very similar environment to the Pacific Island and also Indian Ocean states. And we can share the lessons learned in such part of Japan. For example, we have seen a lot of land-based pollution, such as soil runoff and then excess nutrient discharge into the coral reef area, which devastated the coral reefs in that area. And we have learned lessons how to recover from such pollution. So we call it a ridge to reef approach. And I think this is something we can share the experiences from Japan. And maybe also we have a lot of natural disasters, such as tropical typhoons, tsunamis, and others in the coastal area of Japan. And we are not great infrastructures to protect our coastline, but also areas which we call green infrastructure or blue infrastructure. So, and we are conserving or restoring such ecosystem. So I think that's something like that we can also share with the Pacific and Indian Ocean states. Thank you.
Thank you, Watanabe-san. You mostly, I guess you're also referring to kind of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, because both the oceans face very serious traits of natural disasters, cyclones, typhoons. And I think here, just two things that I wanted to highlight was, one was the Indo-Pacific Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and there's also the International Solar Alliance. And I think there are countries that have come together to create the platforms, create the capital resources and share it. But I hope this forum helps in outlining where those resources can be directed to, what are the projects that can be identified, because the platforms do exist. There is an understanding that you do need disaster resilient infrastructure. What you're referring to is also blue infrastructure, which is done in a sustainable way. And both Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and the Solar Alliance was initiated at the UN, and as we are at the eve of it, I hope that the countries concerned will talk about it and we'll see some projects come out of it. Let me turn to the audience here, open it up for question and answers if there are any questions or comments from anyone in the audience. Randy? Sorry, the mic is just on its way to you.
Thank you very much. Randy Shriver from Project 2049. Appreciate all the presentations. Mr. President, Mr. Ambassador, I wanted to ask you a question. We hear a lot from our friends in the Pacific Islands. They don't like being in the middle of competition. They don't like feeling like pawns. They don't like sort of other people making these strategic moves that impact you without your full input and consultation. But a critic or a skeptic might say, and I'm not necessarily one, but critic might say Kiribati has actually been sort of at the leading edge of trying to leverage and exploit competition, switching formal diplomatic relations to the PRC in 1980, switching back to Taiwan in 2003, switching back to the PRC in 2019, and now even talk that move created some controversy, was very unpopular, and maybe even contemplating another switch. So if you could address maybe, you could address that directly, what informed those moves, but in the midst of this competition, are there opportunities for countries to leverage it to their benefit, and how do you see Kiribati and others perhaps doing this?
Thank you for the question. Very, very interesting question. And of course, I've been, challenged by that question by my friends here in the United States and elsewhere. I travel and they say, "You're flipping over like this. Why are you doing that?" And I said, "I didn't know we've been flipping over. I mean, we're not playing around with these world powers, maybe competing powers. The East versus the West, or China versus the U.S. and etc. No." It's all about the economics, the survival, the economics of survival, economics of moving forward in a country state. No, we're not at all interested in the military apparatus. We are not interested. We don't have investment there. Are not going to benefit from this. What somebody's called it, the industrial military complex. Is that the word the Americans use it? I think I was told that was the word used by President Eisenhower after he won the Second World War. He led the war, and then he came back. Beware of this industrial military complex. And okay, that's a big business. I know that it is very big business for you people in the United States, even in China, even the UK, all these big powers who produce the technology, the killing technology, if you like. We don't have those things. And we're not interested in those things at all. And I've told you a story that is very scary. We don't want a repeat of that. We don't want Kiribati to be turned into another battleground, like I told you, which was very scary. People still live with that. My grandparents and parents' generation, they still feel, they look back and they're sad because they see people being killed. So we're not in that. Let me assure you, 1980, China came to Kiribati. Why? Because our first president President Tabai thought that was the way forward. And now they talk about access, they talk about the market, what have you. So we have fish, we sell it more. 1 billion people buying our fish is better than just 100 million people. So I guess that was the idea of my predecessor. I was leading Kiribati, later on. I was the third president. But when I came, I just sort of assumed the relationship between China and Kiribati. It was a one-China relationship and carried on. Then the one who took over from me decided to have a two-China policy. Why? Maybe it's better to have two partners. One big one, one small one. One socialist and one democratic. Taiwan. But the Chinese say, no, we can't stand that. No such thing as two China. So they took off. And then the current president, 4 or 5 years ago, he flipped over. Well, he decided he was not happy with the way things are happening with a partner, Taiwan. Taiwan was not treating Kiribati well, so he made a decision. Nothing to do with military, nothing to do with this, security, as I mentioned. No, it's all about economic survival of a nation. The schools, you have to have schools, you have to have, the hospitals, you got to run the roads and highway and infrastructure. And that means economy. And economy, you go where it's best for your economy, for your economic survival and economic development. And so this is what's happening in Kiribati. It's nothing to do with that sort of theory that Kiribati is playing around and trying to capture the win from both sides. No, we're not that kind of people. We're not greedy people. We're not. We're very self-sufficient as we are. We're a kind of people who are really peaceful. We're satisfied with where we are, but we want to move on. And I hope I make my point clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think you did answer that pretty clearly in terms of how small states manage the changing, relationships and how that will come out. We are almost at time, but Anna, there's a question to you from one of the virtual participants. It's regarding the PIF in terms of that. Do you think that because of the rift within the Pacific Island Forum and the disappointments lately, do you think the islands will unite together to make a point about the recent deal with the Australia-UK US conversation? Is that a concern in the region that you see that might have some sort of an impact?
Well, I think that we are all waiting kind of with bated breath to hear what Pacific leaders are saying. Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister, James Marape, has made a comment yesterday, and his comment, I think, probably sums up what many Pacific countries feel, which was simply that as long as this doesn't become a source of insecurity for the Pacific, then it's obviously of Australia's business in terms of what they choose to do. So, but obviously, if it does become a source of insecurity for the Pacific, then that is a concern. And I don't expect that we would necessarily see a statement from the Pacific Islands Forum as such. That wouldn't be in the tradition and the convention of the way that the Pacific Islands Forum engages on issues like this. So I think that what we will find is that obviously there's an awful lot of conversations going on both formally and in informal spaces around the region, and there are concerns, though, and civil society, for instance, has spoken out with concerns about this potentially contributing to the militarization of the region, as have others in the region. And we've heard similar thinking in Southeast Asia, for instance, as well.
Thank you, Anna. I'm just going to go ahead and ask you if you had any closing thoughts on that. So I'll go around the panel and then we'll bring it to a close. No, did you have any closing thoughts on this? Any remarks that you wanted to share as from your perspective?
Thank you, Tatiana. And really, my only closing comment would be is that, and this reiterates what President Tito said and others have said as well, which is that there needs to be far deeper understanding of the security concerns in the Pacific Islands region, rather than just simply viewing them through a lens of strategic competition. Because when that happens, so much is missed about what is taking place in the region. And it's fundamentally important to recognize that Pacific Island countries are engaged in highly complex, have highly complex security agendas themselves.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. And I think that's a point that we had a special address by a Sri Lankan Foreign Secretary who also talked about that, not to see through a particular lens, but to hear the stories themselves because there's so much happening at the region, at the ground level. Watanabe-san, any closing thoughts from your end before I hand it over to Ambassador to close the...
Thank you, Darshana. And so I have a short closing comment that I think there's a tendency for Pacific Island countries to be divided into sub-regions. So I'd like to continue dialogue as an NGO to build a relationship with people of Pacific Island countries to, unite again or something like how we can, successfully promote the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. And I hope our forum, which we hope to make it an annual forum, will also contribute towards and provide the platform for these conversations to come on. Ambassador, last word, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I thank Sasakawa Foundation. And I thank my colleagues, Anna and Atsushi, for sort of coming together today. And the people present here, thank you for coming together and we're discussing something very important. And I'm glad that, there's this opportunity to share our perspective of what's happening there, which is also very important for people who want to really help us. If you want to help us, then please take time to listen to what's happening from our own experience. And of course, we thank all those who have been helping us. I mentioned earlier that we haven't received much money on the seawall. In fact, we thank the GCF, the adaptation fund, whatever you call it. There's a big adaptation fund coming, and we're kind of. But there are over 100 areas in Kiribati that need fixing. The seawater is going in. So I'm just hoping that as a result of this, we'll have more assistance coming directed to the problems rather than just floating in the clouds. So I want to thank you. Thank you all for your support and for your engagement. with our issues.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I hope the conversations here will have an impact down the line. Thank you to Anna and Watanabe-san for joining us so late at night, early in the morning, virtually. We're really grateful for your time. Please do join me for thanking the panel. We do have a little bit of a long break after this, a lunch break, because it's a high-level week and a lot of people are moving around. We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock for our next panel on development cooperation and financial institutions in the region. And we'll hear from Japan and Australia, from JBIC and the Deputy Permanent Representative of Australia for a conversation. But please do join me for thanking Ambassador, Anna, and Watanabe-san. Thank you so much.